So charitable trusts. Charitable trusts have a lot of the same rules as other types of trusts. There's 3 significant exceptions to the rules. So it relates to charitable trusts. They must be for a charitable purpose, rather than for one or more ascertainable beneficiaries. I'll repeat that. A charitable trust must be for a charitable purpose instead of for one or more ascertainable beneficiaries. That is a significant difference. In other words, you don't need to have ascertainable beneficiaries in order to have a valid charitable trust. The second significant difference is that a charitable trust, it is exempted from the rule against perpetuities. And because it's exempted, it can continue forever. Because it can continue forever, courts are more likely to modify the trust based on the doctrine of Cyprus. The logic being that circumstances change over time. So as a public policy, it is important to have some mechanism that we can make adjustments to account for these changes in time. The third significant difference, because it doesn't have ascertainable beneficiaries, the enforcement scheme is different. The enforcement scheme is different. This slide gives you some of the high points about the difference between a private trust and a charitable trust. By private trust, we mean any trust that benefits an ascertainable beneficiary. Charitable trust is if the purpose of the trust is for the benefit of a charitable purpose. And remember, if you look at the fact patterns of some of the cases that you have to read for today, it does not need to necessarily, it doesn't always have to be explicit. Okay? We haven't talked about deviation yet when it comes to other types of trusts, but this is good for you to have when you review. It's under a different doctrine that we justify deviation from the trust term. So by deviation, we mean whenever we're going away from what the trust document says. For enforcement, you need to have standing in order to enforce. Beneficiaries have standing for a private trust. For charitable trusts, traditionally it was the state attorney general's office that enforced them. Because the idea is the state attorney general's office brings suits on behalf of the public, on behalf of the citizens of the state. And so if a trust is for a charitable purpose, then it's for the benefit of the citizens of the state. So in 1935, the restatement said that general gifts that did not benefit populations that needed, were shown to have needed to be benefited, were not sufficient to be considered as a charitable purpose. So that was the old rule. The more modern rule is that a charitable trust can be created for the relief of property, the advancement of education or religion, the promotion of health, governmental or municipal purposes, or other purposes, the achievement of which is beneficial to the community. So it is a little bit broader than the previous restatement. All right.
Let's discuss cypress and deviation now.
So changing circumstances, like I said before, might render a charitable trust impractical or obsolete. And it's a very real concern if you have a trust that can continue on forever. Cypress is shorthand for Norman French. What it means is as nearly as possible. Now that sometimes confuses students because you would then think that the court would be required to make the deviation as close to as possible to the settler's intent. But that is not actually how we apply that term in this particular legal context. So the requirements in order to apply cypress is that you have a charitable trust, and the exact purpose of that charitable trust can no longer be executed. And it can't be executed because it's now illegal, impossible, or impractical. As long as charitable intent can be found, the court can direct that the charitable purpose be changed. For example, if you can no longer provide to a hospital, if the trust was created for the purpose of providing funds to a particular hospital or to Cone Moses's indigent care, okay? And Cone Moses goes out of business, and that is no longer a hospital in, say, 50 years. Well, it's impractical or impossible to carry out the purposes of that trust. So a judge can, using the Cypress doctrine, deviate from the trust terms. And he can do so, or she can do so, or they could do so, in any way that they feel would best benefit the community. It doesn't have to be by directing the monies to another hospital, or even to health care of indigent populations, or even to help indigent populations. All right, so let's talk about Henri Nair. It's from the 1930s. The testator here devised her home in Red Hook Village to the village, with the direction that the village used the property as a hospital that would be named after her husband. This was actually real property. The village accepted the real property, so they accepted the gift. And they accepted it on those terms. Then about 6 years later, they decided that they couldn't fulfill the terms and that they already had a modern hospital in a nearby village, so they didn't need to create one in their village. And they came to the court and they asked the court if they could reform the charitable purpose of the trust and instead use the real property as an administration building instead of a hospital building. Used to a surrogate court, or the surrogate court, which is the probate court. They refused to apply Cypress. The court affirmed that, but the New York Court of Appeals found that they found a general charitable intent to benefit the village, and they looked at the language, specifically the clause that said to the incorporated village of Red Hook, and they felt that that was enough to find that the settler wanted to benefit the village. And that this specific direction that came next, which is this red part here, was secondary. That was not part of the general charitable purpose or the general intent. This was just a secondary condition. So, because of that, the testator could use it as an administration building as long as it benefited Red Hook Village. They could strike the secondary part because it wasn't part of the charitable intent. Burden has shifted since this case. Traditional law did not presume the general charitable intent. It had to be proved. Modern law shifts the burden so that the general charitable intent is the presumption, and the party that's opposing it, that's opposing Cypress, has to show otherwise. Modern law modifies the traditional law by presuming general charitable intent. Shifts the burden to the party who's opposing Cypress. So, if a party is opposing a deviation, they will now have the burden to show that there is a lack of general charitable intent. So, when would this come up? This could come up if you are opposing deviation from a charitable trust. You can argue that there is not the settler did not have general intent to have a charitable trust, and instead this is a specific bequest. Or no, you have a charitable trust, there would be a reversion back to the settler after this case. So, Mrs. Buck had chosen the San Francisco Foundation to be the trustee for a very large trust to benefit Marin County in San Francisco. And the funds were to be used to benefit all 5 counties. And this was the one where we had the trust corpus that grew from $9 million to $260 million and then to $300 million. Yes, it's called Having Purchased Property in California in the 70s. If you just held on to it, you would now be a millionaire. If you paid like $100,000 for property in the 70s in California. In San Francisco, you would be a millionaire. So it makes sense why you invest $9 million. And all right. So the trustee sought judicial authorization to spend the trust income in 4 other counties in the Bay Area. And the question was, which was more important, having SSF as the trustee or the Marion County limit? was wastefulness to be something that should be considered when looking at whether or not to deviate using Cypress? Now, the waste added to the UTC as grounds for Cypress, but only in the sense that excess funds relative to the charitable purpose should not be wasted, but to sue. And the question in this case was whether or not there was standing for her to sue. So under traditional law, she would not have been able to bring a suit, but under the modern rule, she can. That is the big takeaway from this case. States that have adopted the modern rule would have allowed Ms. Smithers to sue on behalf of the estate.